Hello and welcome to everybody. My name is Ara Suksi and I'm the director of the School for Advanced Studies in the Arts and Humanities, or SASA, at Western University. We're absolutely delighted to be partnering with Josh Lambier, the artistic director of London's Words Festival, to bring you this event today. It's wonderful that so many of you are here. We have hundreds of people registered, including SASA's first and second year classes, for Professor John Burroughs' presentation, Finding Life's Patterns, Storytelling's Role in Anishinaabe Law. I cannot tell you how I've been looking forward to this event for months. Before we start, I'd like to call on two of SASA's first-year students, Heather Stanley and Jessie Yang, to acknowledge the lens.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Heather Stanley.
And I'm Jessie Yang.
And we'd like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Burroughs for his willingness to speak to us today and to share his knowledge. Before he begins, we'll offer a brief land acknowledgement.
While we understand that land acknowledgements are performative, we also recognize that they are an important symbolic act in working towards reconciliation and a necessary reminder of the history of the land on which we live.
We acknowledge that Western University is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenapehoak, and Chunungtun nations, on lands connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. With this, we respect the long-standing relationships that Indigenous nations have to this land, as they are the original caretakers.
We acknowledge historical and ongoing injustices that Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit endure in Canada, and we accept responsibility as a public institution to contribute towards revealing and correcting miseducation, as well as renewing respectful relationships with Indigenous communities through our teaching, research, and community service. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Jessie and Heather. I'd now like to ask Michael Milde, the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities at Western, to just offer some opening remarks.
Thanks very much, Ara. And a great thank you to Jessie and to Heather for the land acknowledgement, which really does act as a reminder to us all that there is a great deal of work that needs to be done in terms of reconciliation between the First Nations peoples, Indigenous peoples of Canada, and the rest of Canada. It's no surprise, really, that as a Dean of Arts and Humanities, I think that education is a really fundamental aspect that's going to get us to reconciliation. And I really am delighted to welcome so many people who have joined us in this learning experience to get a sense of and an appreciation for Indigenous law that we're going to get from Professor John Burroughs. It's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Burroughs. I'm not going to do the formal introduction. I'm going to leave that to Ara, but it really is a pleasure to have such a distinguished scholar willing to come to us and share the knowledge that we really need to fully appreciate what kind of challenges and issues we have. As we've seen in the recent past, our lack of understanding, our lack of knowledge, our lack of understanding of history in particular has been a real obstacle to getting the equitable and fair nation that we expect Canada to be. So I think today's endeavor is a step, an important step in acquiring the knowledge that will really get us there. So my thanks to Professor Burroughs. Welcome to Western virtually, and a great welcome to people who are joining us virtually. I've seen the chat really is coast to coast and across the nation and across nations. So thank you all for joining us in this endeavor. Ara, and back over to you.
Thanks so much, Michael. Now it is my huge honor to introduce Professor John Burroughs, a person whose work I have greatly admired myself and excitedly shared with students in the SASA program. Professor Burroughs is Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, and a member of the Chippewas of the Nawash First Nation. And he has been the Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Law at the University of Victoria, and has now been named the inaugural Loveland Chair in Indigenous Law at the University of Toronto's Faculty of Law. He specializes in Indigenous legal rights and comparative constitutional law. I really only have time to mention a selection of Professor Burrow's many honors. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, a member of the Order of Canada, a Killam Prize winner, and he's been named one of Canada's 25 most influential lawyers. He's a recipient of an Aboriginal Achievement Award in Law and Justice and of the Indigenous Peoples Council from the Indigenous Bar Association for honor and integrity in service to Indigenous communities. Professor Burrows has taught all over the world, and he has been awarded several honorary degrees. His impact on the study of Indigenous law in Canada has been transformative, as he's helped to shift the focus from Canadian law as applied to Indigenous peoples to Indigenous law in its own right. Professor Burrows has edited and authored several books. I can't list them all, but many of them have been award winners, and those include The Resurgence of Indigenous Law, published 2002, Canada's Indigenous Constitution, 2010, and Laws, Indigenous Ethics, 2019. I am deeply grateful that he has graciously accepted our invitation to speak to us today. So please join me in welcoming him for his presentation, Finding Life's Patterns, Storytelling's Role in Anishinaabe Law.
Miigwech. Buju, Nidinu Manganidok, Niji Anishinaabe, Nijmarazig, Bangietigo Ninata Anishinaabeem, Nigagudi Chunjishna Giganos, Indigenous, Neashi, Winigaming, and Donjaba, Nigigandodem. I'm really grateful to be able to speak with you today about this issue of finding life's patterns, storytelling in relationship to Indigenous law. And I'm grateful for everyone who has joined us from coast to coast to coast, and also really deeply thankful for the invitation that I've received from the folks at Western and through the Words Festival for their hospitality today. Going to jump immediately into my PowerPoint just to share with you some of the issues that I want to talk about. You can see in the background here as we talk about patterns that we have an ancient way of dealing with these things through our wampum, our treaty agreements. Those are patterns that are woven into hide that communicate what our relationships will be with the natural world, with our more than human relatives, with ourselves between Indigenous nations, and then finally with the Crown and those who came at the Crown's invitation as well. And so this idea of patterns is something that's woven through many, many centuries in our legal relationships. As I introduced myself, I said I'm from Nigigandodem. So I'm from the Otter clan. And I'm today speaking to you from Lekwungen and Wasanich territories on the south part of Vancouver Island. These are Douglas Treaty lands, and I'm grateful to be able to live and work and play in this area and get to know these folks and learn about their laws while I'm out in this part of the world. As I mentioned, though, Neashi, Winigaming, and Donjaba. I'm from the Cape Croker Indian Reserve. You can see the arrow pointing there. It's about 3 hours north of Detroit, maybe about 3 and a bit hours north of London, and perhaps about 4.5 hours north of Detroit as well. This is a focused in view of our territory, and you can see the rivers that run into Georgian Bay and Lake Huron that go through our territory. And you can also see in the kind of bronze color there, Neashiwinigaming, our First Nation, as well as Saugeen Nation just on the other side of the peninsula. I want to just situate my talk in relationship to 7+ generations. When I was doing my LLM, my Master's of Law, over 30 years ago at the University of Toronto, it was called the genealogy of law. And I looked at the generations to see the challenges that we'd faced in being able to promulgate our laws, continue along with our way of life. This is a picture of Tecumseh, to walk across. And he's my third great uncle through marriage. He married a woman named Wasega Boa. I also introduced myself today as Giganos, an Indigenous cause. Giganos was therefore Tecumseh's brother-in-law. And Giganos is my third great grandfather, and that's whose name I carry. Gigado means to speak in Anishinaabe. Gigadons is the diminutive of, because it was the role of my third great grandfather in that generation to be able to take account of what was said at formal gatherings and then be able to bring that message forward at subsequent gatherings. So he was an orator and a person that had this responsibility to be faithful in reproducing the words that were said before. The next generation of my family, you've got on the left-hand side here, Peter Giganos Jones. He entered into a treaty dealing with 1.5 million acres of land in Ontario. He put his little otter totem on that parchment to welcome people on our territory, to share our territory in accordance with otter legal principles, the legal principles of the Anishinaabe people. And you can see around his neck are 2 treaty medals. One from that treaty that he entered into in the 1850s, and the other from rescuing a surveyor from the bush around Markdale, Ontario, and taking him down to what was then York during his lifetime, living together with hospitality, demonstrating the treaty in action. On the other side is a book by Verna Patronell and Johnson called Tales of Nokomis. Nokomis means grandmother. And the stories found in this book are stories of my second great-grandmother, Margaret MacLeod. Verna recounts hearing these stories from my second great-grandmother, Margaret. And in the preface to this book, Verna talks about how Margaret would say that these stories were passed to her from her great-great-great-grandmothers. And so the stories and the treaty relationships are rich and deep through many different generations. This is a picture of my great-grandfather, Charles Giganos Jones. He was the most significant figure in my mother's young life as a male figure who was nurturing and loving and helpful and fed her and loved her and looked after her from time to time. And he was a person that embodied kindness and embodied love and lived in accordance with our legal traditions. When he was 97 years old, he walked in out of the bush carrying a deer across his shoulders. So you can imagine the great physical strength that he also had throughout his life. And he was also a runner, and he could take messages between Cape Croker and Ottawa or Toronto or Windsor, and those journeys might take him 7 or 8 days as a runner, but he could do that because he was in shape, but also he knew the foods and the medicines that were on the territory. He didn't have to carry much as he went from place to place because what his mother and his grandmother taught him. This is my grandfather, Josh Jones. He's sitting beside here, my sister, Jennifer Burrows, who's at Neashiwinigaming. She's a family counselor there. She has her PhD in child and family counseling. And Josh himself was a person that shared a lot of stories with me as I was growing up and shared a lot of stories around the community. He could be quite the trickster from time to time. There was a story that was once told. He went into an Ontario bar in a border town in Wyerton, Ontario, and he wasn't really welcome there, but he wanted to make his place known, and someone threateningly arose and said to him, are you Joshua from the Bible who made the sun stand still? And he said, no, I'm Josh from the reserve who made the moon shine still. He would always have this way of being to try to disarm people. When I was a young man, he lived in our northern parts of our territory in what is now the Bruce Peninsula National Park, but also in our reservations there, our reserves there. And he would live for months on end, only coming out of the forest to get some bags for tea, to take it back and live in that quiet space. He also happened to be a Hollywood Indian and spent his time down in LA in the 1930s as he left the reserve and tried to make his way from place to place to place. He went to Kentucky and taught people about medicines that he learned from his great-grandmother. And he also was a great linguist, and he was a rum runner during the temperance era between Detroit and Windsor, a real character in the way that he lived his life. Here's my mother, the most significant teacher that I've had, particularly in terms of Anishinaabe law, but also just as to how I see the world. And you can see I'm here in her arms as a young boy, back in the time when she was engaged in some entrepreneurial activities after having run away from home to get away from residential schools when she was 14 and finding herself out in the broader world around Tilsonburg, at first picking tobacco and later cleaning hotels, until she finally did some night schools and found her way into AV Row and Avro Aero and those sorts of things, doing some office work in that regard. They intermarried with people coming from different parts of the world through the generations. You can see their pictures there. Ella married Charles and Josh married Una, and then my mother married Joseph. And then I have children, and you've got two pictures of them here. The person with their back to you is a Gigata. This is Lindsay Burrows. She's a jingle dress dancer. You can see that she's wearing that regalia. She is now a professor of law at Queen's University Law School, just having started this past year. And then the smaller picture in the insert there is with my other daughter, Megan Chigadase. She is a beautiful teacher as well. She has autism, and it really helps me see the world in such a rich and wonderful way. And so what I'm explaining here is how we learn law and pass along law through the generations as stories are told through the generations. And now I'm a grandfather, I'm a Mishomis, and you can see here on the left-hand side, my first granddaughter, Wasea, which means shining bright and clear. This is a family name. Waseance was my second great aunt, Mary, and it's wonderful to see Wasea carrying on that bright and shiningness. And then the other granddaughter is named Akika. Aki is earth, Akika is the fullness of the earth. And so here we are. I've taken you through 8 generations of my family. And the point, again, is that Anishinaabe law comes through a genealogy of understanding relationships to one another, understanding relationships to the earth, and being told stories through the generations about the things that we might do to create a greater sense of order and purpose and patterns, as it were. In fact, I'm going to talk to you about law as a human activity, as something that we do. I'm going to talk to you about law as something that's a human function. Sometimes we think of laws in institutional perspectives from legislatures or parliaments or courts with the help of judges and lawyers and police officers. And certainly law can be talked about in that way. And yet it's also a narrow way of talking about law, because law, again, is a human function. It's a human activity. It's something that all societies do. They make judgments, they decide things in certain ways, they agree on how to proceed. And you can see one of our words for law is inakonage. In Anishinaabe, 70 to 80% of our language is verb-based. And so it's interesting to think about law as something we do, law as an activity. And if you think about law as an akonage, you can see further, this is from the Ojibwe Online Dictionary, further breaking down to the morphemes of this word. Inakun is in a certain matter or certain direction. It comes from this root, auk, which is stick-like, wood or solid, or to act on it by hand. In other words, you could imagine law as being like a stick by which you would measure something. Law is an activity of measuring in relationship to patterns, right? And so that's what I want to talk to you about today, is how we make measurements by identifying patterns around us in the world and finding ways to have rulings, have agreements, decide things in particular ways. So in this light, what is law again? It's measures, principles, processes, criteria, standards, indicia, benchmarks, precedent, guides, intellectual and cultural resources for regulating affairs or making rules or making decisions and resolving disputes, right? So this is very important for my ideas today, is to help you to see that law shouldn't just be considered in light of legislatures and parliaments and courts and police officers and judges and lawyers. Law is something we all do. Right? You do this in different sectors and different ways. And I want to talk to you about how Anishinaabe people have thought about and continue to think about law. One of the ways that I learned about this was from my good friend, Basil Johnson, an elder who passed away about 5 years ago. But he talked about law in terms of ekinomagewin. And he said, akinomage, akit is the earth. Nomage is to point towards and take direction from the earth. Akinomage win. That's a methodology, right? In other words, our professors about law are the rivers and the sun and the moon and the stars and the clouds and the breeze and the fire and the rocks and the plants and the insects and the fish and the birds and the animals. Those are our professors. Those are our teachers. Those are the ones that help us understand what direction we should be taking and living with one another as human beings, or what not to do in certain instances, as the case might be. So this idea of akinomage is related to our word for kikinomage, which is to teach. Here you've got a quote from Basil: learning comes not only from books, but from the earth and our surroundings as well. Indeed, learning comes from the mountains, valleys, forests, and meadows, which anteceded book knowledge. What our people know about life and living, good and evil, laws, and the purposes of insects, birds, animals, and fish comes from the earth, the weather, the seasons, the plants, and the other beings. The earth is our book, the day its pages, the seasons, paragraphs, the years, chapters. The earth is a book, alive with events that occur over and over for our benefit. Mother Earth has formed our beliefs, attitudes, insights, outlooks, values, and institutions, right? So in other words, our legal archive is literally written on the earth. And he talks about these events occurring over and over and over again. When we understand these patterns and bring ourselves into line with them as peoples, in accordance with our treaty traditions, in accordance with our own law as Anishinaabe people, then we are living this idea of inakonage, a great guided way of decision-making that takes its measures from the surroundings that we find ourselves in. In fact, in many of our written constitutions, which are now appearing, you see these same things expressed. This oral tradition is now being sort of penned, as it were, or put onto paper or screens, as you can see before you. And I'll just read here: Ningodwe Wan Gazette Anishinaabe, one Anishinaabe family, Tebenjagade Gisan Anishinaabe Nekik Gibitguan Garid Manidu Wadazuin. Creator placed the Anishinaabe on the earth, along with the gift of spirituality. Shkore Nibe Aki Nodin Gibi Gorsanun We Nagadame Damang Mom Pishit Kamikong. Here on Mother Earth, there were gifts given to the Anishinaabe to look after: fire, water, earth, and wind. The Creator also gave the Anishinaabe 7 sacred gifts to guide them. They are Zigidawin, Dibwewin, Manandain Damuin, Nabuakawan, Dabadain Dizuin, Kwekwadziwin, Minwa Akadewin. Love, truth, respect, wisdom, humility, honesty, and bravery. Creator gave us sovereignty to govern ourselves. Ki man dana gabi juebag minwa nango megwa e juebag minwa geabi wa ni juebag. We respect and honor the past and the present and the future. You can see these patterns taking guidance from family, from the Creator, from the earth, from the fire, the water, the winds, the gifts that are a part of that are correlated to the earth, the rivers and the heart and the light and the pathways that are before us, which are embedded in these words of love, truth, respect, wisdom, humility, honesty, and bravery. These are things that we can use to govern ourselves in relationship to the past and the present and the future. I want to talk a little bit about how my good friend and Elder Basil Johnson tried to relate these patterns to me as I learned from him from a number of years. And he was a friend and a mentor, and he did speak Anishinaabe fluently. Unlike myself, I do not speak it fluently. He tried to teach me. I've taken it for years and years on end, but he spoke fluently. And he published 18 books in English, and then the other 8 or so in Anishinaabe. He helped me understand myself and our reserve, and through his eyes, I saw our family in another light. He carried many stories during his 86 years, including experiences with my own grandpa Josh that I was telling you about earlier, and he told me many of Josh's stories. His understanding of the earth flowed through his language, and I came to understand through how he talked and how I began to understand Anishinaabe that we are related to the rocks, the ants, the seagulls, the maples, the rivers, the winds, the stars, and the rest of the natural world. But his lessons didn't stop there. For over 40 years now, I've been running most every morning for about maybe half an hour to an hour, and I do this 6 days a week. And when I would run by Basil's place, and I'll just put a picture of what it looked like outside my mom's place there and Basil's place, when I ran by his place, I could see him in the bush there, writing on his porch. He would be outside writing on his porch in the summertime. And in the winter, he would continue writing, but this time on the other side of the porch window, cozy and warm inside his kitchen. And in all seasons, when he wasn't in Mexico, he would look out over this beautiful lake and he would create amazing works of art. In immaculate longhand script, he recounted our history. Our trickster, Nana Bojo, came alive through his work. He told us about Weendigok and little people and bear walkers and our great-great-great-grandmothers through his books. And as I said, he explained the Anishinaabe world through his eyes and left a great legacy as a result. But as I said, what Basil taught did not stop by what he said or wrote. Basil followed patterns. And by so doing, he disclosed another vital life's lesson. That is, as I said, Basil would arise with the sun and he would write as the sun rose. And after some light coffee and a morning breakfast, he would work for hours. In fact, he would work until he got hungry again around lunch. And at that point, he'd get into his car, he'd visit someone in Wyerton or on the reserve, and he'd have a meal. After lunch, he'd return to his home. When he was in his 80s, he'd return to his home for a nap. Part of the writing process, part of our law. When he woke, he would sometimes write for a few more hours before turning his attention to other things for the evening. And in the process, sentences turned into paragraphs, and paragraphs morphed into chapters, and chapters transformed into books. And these books accumulated to create a body of work that transcends his particular life. Now, I recently mentioned these customs to a friend. And as we chatted over poached eggs and toast, she opened my eyes to another dimension of what Basil taught me. She said something like this: humans embody patterns. We sleep, breathe, eat, and move in patterns. Our bodies crave patterns. And I'm sure her experience with the martial arts sharpened this insight. She told me about her experience with martial arts and how that involves patterns. And as she was talking about this, she demonstrated this with a movement of her hands and arms as she spoke. And then I thought about yoga and how it helps people embody healthy patterns too in mindful ways. And then I considered dancers and swimmers who also swim with patterns and dance with patterns. And soon I reflected on my own habit of running, and my thoughts began to further unfold. That is, I saw how Basil's work embodied healthy patterns too. His discipline as a writer, as a teacher, did not just flow from his mind, his heart, his highs, or his experience. His writing was embodied in the patterns that he followed in later years. His words were made of flesh. They flowed from a way of living which harnessed healthy patterns for the benefit of those who love beauty. Basil taught me that discipline allows our bodies and our minds to flourish and create meaningful work and meaningful relations with other people around us. Now, when I think of his life, and then I think more generally, I see another connection, which is patterns involve repetition. My heart beats in a time scale, and it circulates blood through my body. When I walk, my feet fall into a conspicuous pace and gait. When I talk, my words are usually organized by a subject, verb, and object. Linguistics involve patterns of sound and movement. That is, sound and silence are organized through words to enhance our ability to connect with one another. Through these patterns, our world expands as we gain access to other people's thoughts and experiences. Yet Basil's insight runs even deeper. Think of music. Rhythms and beats systematically arrange sound along scales and intervals. Through duration and periodic stress, music is marked by sequences of sound and silence. And this can create patterns that move us. Genres of music are distinguishable by their cadence and their measures. And within a genre, there's significant room for intervention and innovation. So what does this teach me about living? What does this teach me about law? If we try to live without patterns, if we try to practice law without patterns, we do ourselves a disservice. Because the failure to follow patterns denies a basic physiological fact. Therefore, we would do well to analyze and evaluate how our life is organized. We need routines. And I recognize that patterns are not only found within individuals. As I've suggested, they're also basic to human connectivity. We cannot live as couples, families, communities, or societies without some patterns being replicated. My own professional discipline, which is law, is deeply concerned with customary and legislative patterns which organize us more generally. But I'm hoping you're also hearing between the lines here. Patterns can be healthy, but patterns can also be destructive. We must choose carefully the cycles we cultivate and follow. That is, they must harmonize with our bodily rhythms, they must harmonize with the earth rhythms. But some patterns must be broken. Addictions, for instance, can interfere with healthy ways of organizing sleeping, eating, and breathing and movement, right? Technology can do the same thing. It can get in the way of sleeping, eating, breathing, and movement. There are also cancerous collective patterns, and they might be the most damaging of all. Things like racism, sexism, homophobia, and colonialism are perhaps the most pervasive patterns that are harmful. They are replicated, often reproduced, without much thought or effort, and they are deeply embedded in our political, economic, social, and educational systems. They're pernicious, and they spread through families, churches, work sites, universities, recreational activities with ease. They can corrupt every gathering and organization in one way or another. And they they replicate themselves in work, play, and rest. And so we need to think about how our patterns are organizing our measures, standards, criteria, authorities, guideposts, signposts. And that is this idea of law. What are we using to measure our way of looking at the world and making decisions, regulating our affairs and resolving our disputes? Are they from those cancerous patterns, or are they from those patterns that are healthfully reproducing like you see in the screen before you? Now, when I look at patterns around me, I see they're also found in the natural world, right? Atoms and molecules are arranged in patterns. Protein and bacteria are built in replicating ways. Fractals, that is the symmetries we've seen in trees, mountains, lightning, clouds, leaves, and rivers. Those fractals are also found in patterns, and they organize the natural world. We find these patterns with days and seasons and years that pass in an organized manner through the sun and the moon's influences. fact, the snowflakes are also found in patterns. Each snowflake is recognizable as such, but each is unique in its form. That is, we must highlight the fact that a pattern can accommodate distinctiveness. It's true that we must follow basic forms to eat and to sleep and to breathe and cycles to stay alive. At the same time, there's a world of possibility in how we embody and express our basic forms. So this is what Basil was teaching me about patterns. He talked about this as being minopamadzuin, the good life. He said that we should strive for freedom to being indizuin in these patterns. That is organizational forms that are responsive to the Earth's broader patterns. So this is an idea of law that I'm trying to communicate here that Basil organized through stories. And I want to tell you a short story, learning some of this from my mother. There was an old barn out behind our farmhouse, and it stood several stories high. And I can remember going in there and just being fascinated with all of the baby mice and newborn kittens and freshly hatched chicks and spiders and bugs that I would find in the bales of hay. It was really filled with life. Well, one day when I was about 10 years old, I was exploring the chicken coop on the second floor. This room had 2 windows, and these windows were about 3 feet above the floor. And I wanted to see outside, but I was a little too short at the time. So I jumped up to rest my stomach on one of the windowsills to get a better view. And in so doing, I could see along the creek, beyond the ravine, to the forests and the fields that were in the distance. And as I was looking out that window from that sill, my feet dangled from about a foot off the floor. And when I'd finished taking it all in, I pushed myself back down off the window's ledge. But upon landing, I felt a sharp pain in my foot. That is, a rusty nail pierced my North Star running shoes, and it actually stuck into the center of my foot. It hurt so much I could hardly stand, but no one was around to help. I had a hard time pulling out the board with the nail from my sole. It was excruciating. And when I eventually pried it loose, I had to limp back into the house. And then insult was soon added to injury. I remember going to the doctor, and I was stabbed with a needle that seemed bigger than the nail that I had encountered earlier. It was for a tetanus shot. And then I had difficulty walking for weeks. And this curbed my enthusiasm for this old building for quite some time. This once safe space became a site of distress, and I wanted nothing to do with the barn. Yet I still walked the land. One day, while winding through the ravine, I paused under one of those old, large, white pine trees that grew on the slopes of the ravine, and I saw something struggling at its base. It was Cake, which was a fledgling red-tailed hawk. It had fallen and had damaged its wing. And so, seeing its trauma, I ran to get my mother, who cautiously approached it when she arrived. And when she found that the bird didn't resist, she quickly picked it up and she held it by its legs with its talons away from her body. So she was cradling it in her arms as she walked back to the barn. And it wasn't long before she placed it in that old empty chicken coop. So with the hawk safely in the barn, my mother soon called an official from the Department of Natural Resources. She called to ask for help. Fortunately, it was a discouraging call. They were fairly pessimistic. They said the hawk's wing sounded like it was broken, and therefore the hawk would probably never fly. They said they couldn't care for it, and they said that we should dispose of it. Well, my mother had no such intent. She did what she could do to help. So when the government's resources fail and formal legal channels are ineffective, law's paths are not exhausted. Again, law, including its Anishinaabe forms, draws from stories, standards, principles, processes, criteria, measures, indicia, benchmarks, guides, precedents to help us make decisions and facilitate order. Law is not merely the preserve of specialists. So, when faced with the Hawk's needs, my mother drew on our Anishinaabe legal traditions. She remembered our community's teachings. She talked to her family back home on the reserve, and she read about the birds' dietary needs. She also spoke to other people who knew something about red-tailed hawks. Then, remember, laws of verb? Then she took action. She did something to meet her obligations. Every day, she fed the hawk on cat food, mice, and water. This gave the hawk care and the space it needed to heal. And I soon learned that when you entered the coop, the hawk would just stare back at you. And when you left the coop, you could spy on it through the slats in the wall of the barn's little room there. You could watch it, hop over it to its meal. Well, as the months passed, the hawk seemed to get stronger and stronger until one day it tried to fly to its food. This flying, this approaching the food was awkward at first, but it eventually succeeded. And through time, we could see that the bird was getting stronger. With its health seemingly restored, my mother then made a plan to release it. What did she do? What did we do? We opened the barn's main doors, and we did the same thing with the interior doors of the chicken coop. We placed some food in a row, Hansel and Gretel style, to tempt the bird out of the chicken coop. But at first, the hawk was just content to sit amongst the bales of hay. Its movements were tentative. Why should it leave? Everything was taken care for it there. So we began making some noise, waving our arms and yelling, trying to get it shaken out of its complacency. And as we did so, eventually the hawk did jump to the door's edge, at the edge of the chicken coop door. And then it found that trail of food, and it followed that food piece by piece until it stood at the threshold of the main barn doors. At this threshold, the hawk, again, it stood stock still. You could see the ravine, you could see the forest, you could see the barnyard, but it seemed hesitant to leave. But finally, something sparked the hawk's intuition. It suddenly sprung from its perch and glided over the barnyard. It landed on the old hand pump near the well house, and then the bird looked back towards the open barn door. Again, it seemed to sit there for ages, but abruptly, with massive force, eventually this bird sprang into the air. It was testing its wings, and it began catching the currents. It slowly gained altitude. The hawk circled the barn before looking down on us below. For about 5 to 10 minutes, this hawk gently rose through the air before heading out over the fields to complete freedom. This image will forever be etched in my mind. The experience also helped me to learn something about healing as it relates to patterns, what my mother did, and it helped me realize about law's potential, Anishinaabe law's potential in this process, though I didn't realize it till years later. One of the things that I discovered was that a place we associate with pain does not always have to remain that way. That place can be transformed through knowledge, care, and time, or having people like my mother, a jurist, someone who practices Anishinaabe law and helps me understand how we can organize our lives in those patterns. So my career has been about trying to identify the patterns of Anishinaabe law, the patterns of Canadian law and how they sometimes can be woven together. If we think about ourselves as a multi-juridical nation with common law and civil law and Indigenous legal traditions, we need to question first principles in the process and also recognize that we continue to have a colonial constitution at the same time as we have an Indigenous constitution, right? Some of those patterns are cancerous. Some of those patterns are so healthy. One of those patterns I try to identify is that we cannot be reconciled with one another until we are reconciled with the earth. I've also written about our 7 grandmother and grandfather teachings in a book called Laws, Indigenous Ethics, and then also try to think about these patterns in economic justice as well. You'll see the fractals there behind this otter and thinking through those relationships. It's also important to think about this in relationship to international law. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples has patterns that can be harmful or helpful, depending on how we pick them up. And then finally, I try to think about these things through state law. And obviously, as I mentioned before, legislatures work through patterns, courts work through patterns, critique patterns that aren't healthy, encourage patterns that are more productive. And then just this week, a book came out called Voicing Identity, Indigenous Appropriation, Cultural Appropriation and Indigenous Issues, trying to think about those patterns in creative ways that draw on some of our artistic traditions. So with that, I'll say meet you. Miigwech bizindu eg ahau. I look forward to the questions that the students will have in a moment, and then questions that you'll have as an audience as we have about, 40 minutes or so together before we're complete. So thank you again for these moments, and I look forward to what lies next.
Well, Professor Burrows, I'll echo what I just read in the comments. Thank you for this beautiful teaching. That was a very rich and beautiful and thought-provoking and a nourishing talk. And I think that especially when we read between the lines, as you suggested we should be doing, there are all kinds of things that we can learn from what you've told us. So thank you so much. I'm so grateful that you're willing to stay and answer some questions. To the online audience, if you have questions that you would like to ask of Professor Burrows, please do type them in the Q&A function. And in the meantime, to warm up our question period, we do have a couple of students from the SASA first year class here at Western University. And I'm going to call on them. So we'll start with Isabel Fox. Isabel, are you ready to ask your question?
Hi, I'm the aforementioned Isabel Fox. And my question is, in your essay on love and law, you comment on the government's fiduciary responsibility with Indigenous people, but you focus overwhelmingly on reciprocating love in legislation instead of honoring trust. Why did you focus more on love? Or is love just a more natural pattern of human connection within Anishinaabe law?
Thank you for that question. So in this book that I wrote called Laws, Indigenous Ethics, one of the chapters is about law and love. And it is there to show that when we entered into treaties with the Crown as Anishinaabe people, love was a part of what was expressed by ourselves and by the Crown in relationship to some of those treaties in our territory. Now, where does that come from? It wasn't just there coming out of the blue. Anishinaabe people have a tradition of looking at the natural world around them and finding how to live in accordance with love. And so one of the things that Basil taught me about is he said, if you go to the river mouth, Zagin, where the Zagin Anishinaabe, you'll see this great body, this great force, this great power that delivers energy. And it collects that energy for hundreds of miles, first of all, in small little rivulets as rain and water runs off the land into these rivulets that eventually gathers in creeks and then creeks into streams, eventually streams into this main river. And all the while, as it's gathering this energy, it's transporting microbial life. And as this microbial life gets deposited in various parts of the territory through the water, it eventually finds its greatest force again at the river mouth. And at those river mouths, with that great gathering of energy from that microbial life, you get all sorts of plant life that forms. The algae and the fungus and the moss and the little reeds. So there's just a great diversity of all sorts of plants, and then the grasses and the flowers and the medicines and the trees. We call all of this mushkike. Mush is strength, ake is earth. Mushkike, the strength of the earth. This is our word for medicine, mushkike. The medicines are created by this flow of energy, this flow of water in this defined channel that the river produces. Of course, with those plants, then you get all sorts of little insects that start to move in. These insects in Anishinaabe are called manidu shaisak, manidu, right? Little spirits. So these little spirits move in and amongst the medicines, the strength of the earth, and they feed, of course, on those that organic matter. And then, of course, they give their lives back to the earth when they pass away. And so there's more strength for that next round, as then you find little fish running in and amongst the reeds, eating the plants, eating the insects. And of course, bigger fish come with those little fish, and you get a building of the framework of life. And with that, then birds gather at the river mouths in great diversity. Those are stopovers often as birds fly from the Arctic back down to Mexico. But there's also year-round residents and residence birds that stay there through entire seasons. And so there's a lot as those birds feast on the fish and the insects and the plants. And then, of course, what happens is animals come into the mix. All of these Awasiyak are there, and they're making their hopes and opportunities and lives in that place. And then, of course, in the summer seasons, spring, summer, fall, the Anishinaabe people gather to those sites and feast on everything else that's there. You see what that river has done? By delivering all that energy, it's created a flow, a force of abundant sustainability with a diversity of life, with an interdependence of life, such that there's a flourishing for many, many different beings. Basil said, if you want to learn about love, you look at the river mouth, and the river will teach you how to love. In other words, let's gather the energy that we receive from different parts of life, have it pass through us as it increases and increases, so that it also is delivered through a channel that helps to create a diversity, an abundance, a richness, a sustainability, an ecosystem of possibility. So who teaches about love? The river teaches about love. That's our teacher, right? That's our professor. And Zagin is the word for that river mouth. You might know, if you're in Toronto, Michizaga, Mississauga, right? That word is found in various parts of the territories. This word, Zagin, our word for love as Zagidawin. And Basil wanted me to notice the similarity in sound, although they might not be etymologically related. He wanted to reinforce that that's how we learn our laws. So when we learned about how to live in our territory, we watched. And when we entered into treaties with the Crown, what did we do? We entered into treaties for as long as the rivers flow. And the sun shines, Zagate, and the grass grows, Zagibaga. So we've got Zagin, Zagate, Zagibaga, Zagidawin. This idea of energy flowing is a legal tradition. It's embodied in patterns of healthy living that you see in the earth and in the waters around us. And so when I was writing that chapter, I was wanting people to see that treaties aren't just formed from a Western perspective, they're also formed from an Anishinaabe perspective, and they're relating to our patterns for life and law, which in this instance embody love.
Much. That was very beautiful. Thank you. Giselle.
Hi, my name is Giselle, and the question I have for you today goes, in your book, Laws Indigenous Ethics, you state Canada has repeatedly affirmed that historic treaties and other rights are to be interpreted in a large, liberal, and generous manner,
in a manner that they would naturally be understood by the Indians, resolving any ambiguities in their favor. Love as a treaty principle fits these frameworks. Does this mean that you agree with how Canadian government is handling legal and ethical issues with Indigenous communities?
So I find possibility in the Canadian legal system. I also find harm in the Canadian legal system. And so part of my work is to try to encourage those patterns that lead to healthier living and reject those patterns that would lock us in racism and colonialism and sexism and homophobia and deny self-determination. So having said that, these principles of treaty interpretation that you've quoted are from the Supreme Court of Canada. And they said we should interpret treaties with a large, liberal, and generous perspective, interpreting them as the Indians would naturally understand them, resolving ambiguity in favor of the Indians. Treaties, the documents themselves are only evidence of the treaty. The documents themselves are not the treaty. Right? The documents are evidence of the treaty. The treaty is the agreement, which is an intersocietal engagement between legal traditions to try to produce a pattern of, as you saw, linking arms together in those wampum belts, or two-row rivers flowing together, or a dish with one spoon. There are many, many images on those wampum belts that talk about our treaties being a bridge between legal cultures. And in fact, the Supreme Court of Canada has called our treaties a bridge between legal cultures. The word they say is we need to best reconcile the common intention of the parties at the time the treaties were entered into. Another part of this, they sometimes use Latin. They say treaties are sui generis or sui generis, which means they're unique or of their own kind, which again means you can't just interpret them by contract law or property law or Western legal tradition. You also have to interpret them by Anishinaabe or Haudenosaunee or Cree or whatever the Indigenous community is that's entering into those treaties. Those are the standards, principles, criteria, authority, measures, guideposts, signposts for regulating our affairs and resolving our disputes. So Indigenous treaties have patterns that in some parts of Canadian case law is encouraged. And what we need to do is bring further light to those doctrines and, of course, diminish and ultimately reject doctrines based on discovery and occupation and conquest and adverse possession. Those are very unilateral. They suppose superiority on the part of one party and the inferiority of the other party. Those things have to change. And treaties are about reciprocity. They're about mutuality. They're about love. They're about creating a relationship, appealing to our better and our higher selves.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Isabel and Giselle, for some very thoughtful questions and for those good answers also. We do have quite a few questions now in the Q&A, and there's one anonymous attendee who is responding to your acknowledgement of the harmful and cancerous patterns that we see. How can we prevent or stop the patterns of racism? That's a tough one, eh?
It is. And of course, there's many different answers to this question. I have two mantras I often speak by. One is nuance is sacred. Another is beware the danger of a single story. So, if I could tell our creation story, which I'm not going to, it's a story of animals gathering together in council with one another and getting different points of view and listening to the smallest amongst us to try to figure out what the answers to great challenges might be. So part of answering this question is to listen to many different voices, and in particular, listen to those that are most affected by racism, like that little muskrat in our creation story. See what I'm doing here? I'm starting to try to answer this question by reference to an Anishinaabe story, and drawing out of this story principles and processes that could help us think through the answers to those questions. Another part of this is to go back to that red-tailed hawk story that I was talking about a moment ago. How might we analogize what I talked about in that instance to the challenge of racism. Because I think we've all been in places where we feel like someone's left around nails and we've stepped on them and we've been traumatized by the sharpness of those words and the sharpness of that systemic harm. And how do you heal from that racism? How do you go back to places when you've been traumatized by those rusty points of, quite frankly, toxic to your bloodstream and toxic to your being? Well, the story contains some reflections on part things that could be done, as you would then try to think through, by way of analogy, what could happen to try to deal with some of those challenges like racism. So part of what I want to say is we should look to the natural world around us and see what we're taught there about how to overcome racism, and look to our stories, and as Anishinaabe people, look to our laws to see what we can do so that we don't ourselves sort of end up piercing others with nails, but we find ways for others to be able to soar. And there's more to say about that, but that's just a beginning.
We have a number of questions that I can see a common theme, and the questions are about healing. And so the one that we just had was obviously a question about how to heal racism. We have a question from Aileen Strong. It's a slightly different, direction. And she's asking, what will make the most healing impact on the nations now?
Yeah, what would make the most healing impact on the nations now? This is going to sound like it's not answering the question, but I'm seeing the beautiful sun shining on the leaves outside my window right now. And I'm feeling the crispness in the air as I walked here to my office as the seasons are changing. And there's a kind of harvest being reaped here as we've seen the abundance of this past season. And I, the other day, was out running. And when I finished running, I sat just by my garage. And as I was sitting by my garage, I started hearing this beautiful little bird singing. And at first it was just at the edge of my attention, but it was so amazing, it eventually occupied my full attention. So I looked up and I saw a little nuthatch. And it was just amazing the way that its vocalizations could capture the feelings that I felt in that moment. But as I watched it, I noticed that where it was sitting, the tree was very distressed. As you may know, British Columbia's had a drought for about 3.5 to 4 months, very, very little rain. And that tree's leaves, before even the color started turning it, were withering. And so by watching the bird, my attention was drawn to the leaves of the tree, and I noticed the distress that the tree was under. And then I looked around me and I saw that I was just sitting by our tap, which is at the side of the garage. There was a little hose there. And so I turned on the hose just to give that roots to that tree a little bit of relief from the drought that we're going through. And the water started to flow. And you know what water sounds like when it flows? It's a little bit like laughter, right? If you get that sound that's just rolling over it, it was joy. And that joy of that water joined with the song of the bird. And I kept watching the bird. And what did the bird do? Not surprisingly, it started making its way down the tree until it was sitting there at the base of the tree, also drinking from that water. So the question about how do we go about healing, how do we go about dealing with the challenges that we're facing, what would most impact our nations in terms of healing? It would be seeing the birds, hearing the water, noticing the distress, paying attention to the sun, having that fill your being, and then finding something that you could do in reciprocity, even if it's just an appreciation of the bird's song, right? That's a reciprocity. If you can take another step by doing something for the bird or the tree or the water, right? It's this idea of a kinomagewin, learning from the patterns that are outside our door and seeing, how can I be like that? How can I learn from that? How can I bring what's there to my own life and to my relations? And so, that is something that could be scaled up tremendously. And we could talk about ways to do that through language revitalization and helping people overcome poverty and getting out of the criminal justice system where all you see is prison walls around you, or dealing with better institutions that can listen to Anishinaabe languages and Anishinaabe stories and Anishinaabe law. Right? You can scale up quite tremendously from the point I'm making, but it's also something that you can do and we can do. We don't have to wait for a parliament or a judge or a police officer. It's lifting your face to the wind, the rain, the sun, and expressing appreciation. There's an elder I really admired on our reserve. His name is Archie Johnson. He passed away a couple of years ago. And Joyce told me this the other day when I was speaking to her. Ken asked Archie, Ken is Archie's son-in-law, stepson, asked, Archie, how do you pray? Archie thought about it for a moment and he said, Miigwech. And Ken said, is that it? Archie said, yes. Miigwech Gajemnado. Thank you. Right? Saying thank you is, in relation to this broader world, one of those building blocks, those patterns of healing.
We have so many questions starting to come up and I want to apologize in advance to people if I can't get to everybody's question, and I'm going to try to draw on a range of kind of different types of questions. Here's one from W. Monag, excuse me if I have mispronounced your name. Would First Nations be wise to draw from our ancient knowledge in the way you speak when designing policies and bylaws within communities? Is it best to move our policies away from Western influence and language? And how do we reconnect to those nearly lost teachings of natural laws? And they say, Ahau Miigwech.
Ahau Miigwech. I went to school with some Monags in Barrie, and so hello, it's good to be with you today. That's a great question. I do think the best place to develop these policies, these laws, are in our closest intimate relations. And if that's as far as they go, we will be rich, rich, rich in those settings if we can help one another in our families, in our communities, in our work sites, really try to find place to live in relation with the kinds of things that we're talking about. I do think that there's a place for turning away from the state. In other words, we shouldn't expect the state to be the final answer or the beginning of the answer to the questions that we face. Again, law is not just a noun, it's a verb, it's something we do. And so it's something that we can do in that setting. Having said that, I've spent 30 years as a law professor also teaching Canadian law and international law. And there are places over 30 years that I've seen developments, right? The recognition of Aboriginal and treaty rights, even though there's still so much work to do, is better than the alternative 30 years ago, where those rights could be extinguished without any second thought, as long as the Crown spoke in a clear and plain way. That is no longer allowed in Canadian law. Those rights cannot be extinguished. It's also the case that if they're going to be affected, that is infringed, the government has to meet a high standard of obligation. They can't just do what they want. In other words, what the Constitution has done is constrained Crown sovereignty. And it's constrained Crown sovereignty because Aboriginal and treaty rights are part of the highest laws of the land. And the Crown can't just do it at once because it has to recognize those pre-existing Aboriginal rights and those negotiated treaty rights that were in advance of people coming from other parts of the world. And so I do think that there's place in the state, not that it's a perfect place. It's got its flaws for sure, but there is a possibility for developing reciprocity, relationality, and sometimes you're seeing this in legislative fora. As you know now, the federal government has passed a law to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's a weak law for sure, but it does contain a process that is designed to get people talking together, an invitation to have Indigenous law be a part of Canadian law. There's also Child and Family Services Law, Bill C-92 is a part of that mix. Again, flaws and problems with it. But in other words, we have to take care. Nuance is sacred. Beware the danger of a single story. There might be some things that can be done, but I don't think it should be the exclusive or the only place to do that work. And sometimes the work should not be done in relationship to the state.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that answer. I'm going to read two questions to you because I think they might be related, although in my ignorance of law, I might be wrong about that. So the first one is from Andrew Manitowabi, and he asks, what happens when Anishinaabe law and the rule of law come into conflict? How do we reconcile with our Anishinaabe identities, belief systems, when the rule of law is imposed upon us as Indigenous peoples on a daily basis via colonialism in education systems? And then Sam Manitowabi, I didn't realize there were last names were correlated there, asks, is it more effective to assert inherent rights as an Anishinaabe versus asserting Aboriginal rights under Section 35?
Let me take that second question first.
Okay.
Rights are about relationships. So let me say this. Section 35(1) of the Constitution says, the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed. Right. So what's done in this section of the Constitution? Existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of Aboriginal peoples of Canada are recognized and affirmed. But whenever you pick up the stick of rights, there's something on the other end of that stick. It's called obligations. You can't pick up rights without also picking up obligations, right? They're just they're part of the same structure. So in that light, you could say the existing Crown obligations in right of the province and the federal government are hereby recognized and affirmed. Section 35(1) is not just about affirming rights, it's also about affirming the obligations that the Crown has to Indigenous peoples through the treaties and through the pre-existence of Indigenous peoples on this land with their own governments and legal systems and ways of life. So if Section 35(1) is about Crown obligations as well as Aboriginal rights, then yes, sometimes Section 35(1) should be the mechanism that's used to try to advance these questions, because it's not just about Indigenous peoples, it's about those others that we're in relationship with. Now, Sam's question, the other question is really important because it invites us to think about the rule of law more broadly. The rule of law is the rule of patterns, and we have to identify what are healthy patterns and what are harmful patterns. And those patterns, to determine whether or not they're healthy or harmful, we need a measure, and not konage, right? We need a measure to determine whether or not something is healthy or harmful. And how do we measure that? By story, by language, by treaty, by the natural world that's around us, by deliberating with one another, by talking with one another, trying to persuade one another, being in those council-like settings where different voices are listened to, including the voices of those that are smallest, so-called, amongst us, those voices that would otherwise be overlooked. those are the voices that actually bring about creation through their action and recreation. And so, again, sometimes those conversations have to take place just in your own heart as you're running in the morning or walking or just looking out your window, sometimes in your relationship with your partner, sometimes with your family, sometimes with a group of families in a community setting. But you can scale it up in some instances and try to find whether or not that's the case there. And in some of the environmental assessment processes, I actually find Anishinaabe law and Indigenous law informing how we should be in a particular area if there's a mine or forestry or other sorts of development that are proposed. And so there's lots to say on that front as well.
Okay, thank you. There's a very generous question from Kalayuti Ninham. As an Indigenous person who constantly gets asked, what can I do to be an ally? What can we do in turn to build on those relations as well? It seems to me that reconciling relations is everyone's responsibility, and there are numerous levels or aspects to any successful relationships. I ask my question in the spirit of reconciliation and how we get past providing our truth in order to get to the steps of reconciliation.
Yeah, so how can you become an ally and how do we reconcile those relations? This idea that it's everyone's responsibility, but at different levels is part of what this question is pointing out. That for me is generating a thought from my childhood. When my mother was teaching me how to cook, I was maybe 5, 6 years old, and I would sit on the counter and I would watch her throw all the dry ingredients into the big yellow bowl. So there'd be the flour and the sugar and the baking soda and those other, maybe there'd be some spices. And after all those dry ingredients were mixed together, she would pull out this little tiny grain. She said, see this small seed? If I don't put this seed into this mix, it won't rise. It won't sort of be as fulsome, as large, as big as it might otherwise be. She was talking about yeast. She said, if I put a little bit of yeast into these ingredients, then the rest of this will rise. And so I'd watch her do that. Sometimes she'd leave the yeast out and we'd have very flat cakes. And sometimes I'd watch her put the yeast in, and of course, they'd be very puffy and fluffy. And I've often thought this area is like that, which is not everyone has to know everything about these entire worldviews, but we need yeast in places where these views, these perspectives, these thoughts, these understandings can be injected such that other things could be activated by those being present. That sort of relieves the pressure, because then not every single person in Canada has to understand Anishinaabe law or reconciliation or healing, but some people do. And as those people do, that can be activated in ways that could help others that are just kind of, they rise along with the rest of what's there. I also want to pick up just on the etymology of responsibility, which is, we have the ability to be able to respond. And we can all respond in different ways. It's not meant to be a fusion of horizons or assimilation. And of course, we want to see truth as a part of reconciliation as well. But if we are at different places with different abilities to respond, then that just reinforces the question, which is, we can take this in small or large ways, depending on where we're situated, depending on where we might feel like we could be activated.
It's a beautiful analogy, a little seed of yeast. I love that. We'll just have time for just 2 or 3 more. Ronald George is asking, what is your excuse my pronunciation, what is your understanding of the root meaning of Nakonigawen? Is it planning or is it to pursue planning? And what does that mean to you? What does that literal meaning tell you about the concept and related aspects of the meaning of Nakonigawen? That is karma, things in their place, cause and effect, etc.
Yeah, it's a great question. Let me just take you back to the Ojibwe Online Dictionary again. Anakonage is a verb animate intransitive, which means it's something that's living, and it's he or she makes a certain judgment, decides things in a certain way, agrees on something. And then when we think about where that root comes from, it's that certain direction or certain manner, which is stick-like wooden or organic matter. We act on it by hand. And if we turn it into a noun, anakonagewin, it's a law, a ruling, or an agreement. So in answer to your question, it's both to plan and to pursue planning, because we can conjugate verbs in tremendously rich ways. If you know anything about Anishinaabe, and again, I'm not fluent, but I know you put the verb in the middle, and then you put all sorts of pronouns and time markers and locatives, location dimensions, and directional markers. And so you can make this idea of anakonage move in the world. So think about law as something we conjugate, not classify. And if our goal is to conjugate and not classify, we're not trying to define and put into a small box what the meaning of a particular concept is. It's how do we move this into our relational possibilities. And I'll just give an example that's a little bit humorous. Our word for blueberry pie, it's chigiatuemna goshimna bashkimna sage bito shigana babgan bequajigan. I'm going to say that again. I am getting mixed up with it. The point of the word is it's the old time Frenchman putting berries between two pieces of bread, spreading them around, bending over, putting them into the oven, and watching those berries explode. In other words, the blueberry pie is not a category, it's an activity. It's something that's done. And so it is with law, right? There, I got it that third time. Right? This idea is to illustrate that we're both planning and pursuing planning because we're constantly mixing it up. We're constantly in the process of lawing. Lawing is what we're doing. And so, yeah, there we go. And of course, there's other words for law. Ijatuawanan is another word that's often used, which is kind of like some customary law. And some people put other prefixes like kagage, anakonagewin, like long time law. And I talked about akinomagewin a moment ago. There are many, many different verbs to use for this activity of decision making together.
I am going to ask your indulgence and ask a question myself, if that's okay. As somebody who works in the Faculty of Arts and Humanities and works with so many creative students, when we talk about patterns and storytelling, and we talk about the patterns we see in nature, and we talk about the patterns within our bodies, our embodied patterns that keep us alive, how do you see the role of art, the creation, the intentional creation of patterns, in terms of how it affects our well-being in sphere of law or otherwise? That's a big question.
Yeah. So law needs to be nourished. It's living. It needs to be feasted. Needs to be brought into relation. Our Atazukanag are living stories, and as living beings, they have movement, and so yes, that role of arts is quite profound. I love being on the West Coast here and learning about how the Indigenous peoples practice law in this setting, because you often see them with button blankets that have beautiful clan or house markings that are sewn on the back, killer whales and eagles and wolves and fireweed. And around that, you'll have shells that are sewn in that to reflect brilliantly and brightly in the sun. And they're often colorful, sometimes black and red, but sometimes I've seen yellow and black. And so there's this beauty in weaving as a part of presenting what the standards, principles, criteria, authority measures are. So weaving is a part of law. And then, of course, with those button blankets, what people do is they dance. Law is danced into the feast hall through stories that tell patterns about how things have gone good or not so good. And we learn from the good or not so good from past instances. And we apply those stories, those dances to the situation we find ourselves in now. So there's woven images that are danced. And then what do people do is they sing. Can you imagine singing law? Law is sung in some legal traditions. And then you join it with the drum, the heartbeat of our mother, the earth. And then with masks, there's a representation of sometimes the transformation that goes on in the stories of one image opens up to another image as the issue goes through. And then storytelling and giveaways, right? So it's visual, it's oral, it's embodied, it's celebratory, it's grief, it's some of these feasts out here are about crying. And crying is a necessary part of law, to mourn for the loss and to make recompense for that loss and to fully identify that issue as a trauma that needs to be healed. So the point is that in all legal traditions, you find in Indigenous communities different dimensions of these ways of bringing the arts to bear with law. They're not two separate worlds. Right? Art is a part of law, law is a part of art. And in the natural world, there's our guidance.
That's just so beautiful. I'm so inspired. You know, John, I can tell from the comments in the chat and too from the Q&A, people are just so hungry to hear from you and to listen and to get your wisdom. There's so much gratitude being expressed for this session, and I know that if we had time, we could go on all night probably, but we don't. We're going to have to say goodbye now, and so I just want to, if I may, I want to say miigwech. I want to say thank you to you. This has been a beautiful hour and a half, and you've really given us a wonderful gift. Thank you so much.
Miigwech Kinawea. Thanks everyone for joining, and I wish you all the best and I hope our paths cross soon. Aha. Bamapi Gigawabman.